Ladies and gentlemen, in a world where words are often drowned in noise, few moments command absolute silence. Fewer still emerge from voices long marginalized, steady, defiant, and unshakable. One such moment occurred when Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader of Burkina Faso, stood before the African Union, not just as a president, but as a symbol. His words didn't echo. They resonated. His message didn't flatter, it challenged. And when he finished speaking, the room didn't erupt in applause. It sat silent, not out of confusion, but out of recognition. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech at the African Union sent a jolt through the chambers, not simply because of its delivery, but because of the weight behind his words. Words that pointed to the deep and enduring struggle for Africa's true sovereignty. In this first and most compelling keynote, Traoré addressed what many African leaders have hesitated to confront directly: the persistent shadow of neocolonialism. Though formal colonial rule has long been dismantled, its structures, influence, and exploitation remain intact in subtler, more insidious forms. Saint Traoré's insistence on reclaiming African sovereignty is not just about independence on paper, but about a total break from economic dependency, foreign military control, and intellectual subjugation. He stood as a mirror to the continent's past and a challenge to its present, questioning whether the current system, dominated by foreign interests, can ever truly serve African people. He asked the African Union, and by extension the African elite, whether it is possible to talk about development, peace, and democracy while Western powers still control much of the continent's wealth, dictate political outcomes, and sponsor instability when it suits their interests. His voice cut through the usual diplomatic language and forced a reckoning with the reality that many African nations are still tethered to former colonial masters through economic agreements, military bases, and development aid packages that come with strings attached. Traoré specifically highlighted the exploitative nature of Africa's resource management. While the continent sits atop vast mineral wealth, gold, uranium, cobalt, and oil, these resources are often extracted and exported by foreign multinationals, with only a fraction of the profits returning to the countries of origin. He described this arrangement as modern-day pillaging, an economic structure that mimics colonial extraction, only now cloaked in legality and global trade norms. The language of investment and partnership, he argued, is often a mask for control and exploitation. When foreign companies dominate mining licenses, set prices, and control export channels, the sovereignty of African states is hollow. Even more provocatively, Traoré raised the issue of military sovereignty. He questioned why so many African countries still rely on foreign troops, especially from former colonial powers like France, for internal security. Using Burkina Faso's own experience as a case study, he recounted how foreign military presence had failed to prevent terrorism and insecurity, and in some cases had coincided with their worsening. By ejecting foreign military bases and asserting national control over security matters, Traoré positioned his country as an example of reclaiming true independence. He made it clear, sovereignty means Nothing if a nation cannot control its own borders, defend its own people, and determine its own military priorities without foreign direction. Another striking part of Traoré's speech was his challenge to the political and institutional complicity of African leaders. He criticized the tendency of some African governments to protect elite interests while ignoring the needs of the people. This elite class, he suggested, often acts as an intermediary for foreign powers, protecting their interests in exchange for political support, loans, and personal gain. In Traoré's view, reclaiming sovereignty requires not only rejecting external domination, but also dismantling internal systems of governance that replicate colonial logic. Systems that exclude the masses, suppress dissent, and prioritize international image over national integrity. Traoré also emphasized the role of education in reclaiming sovereignty. He noted that much of Africa's educational systems are still modeled on Western frameworks, teaching children about European history, values, and philosophy, often to the neglect of indigenous knowledge systems, languages, and heroes. This intellectual dependence, he argued, fosters a kind of mental colonization that makes young Africans more likely to admire foreign models and doubt their own capacity for innovation and leadership. For sovereignty to be real, Traoré insisted, Africa must cultivate a new generation educated in its own image, proud of its roots, confident in its ability, and prepared to chart its own future. Economically, Traoré made a case for bold reforms that would prioritize African needs over international market demands. He argued for regional trade, currency independence, and the nationalization or renegotiation of strategic industries. He specifically criticized the use of foreign-controlled currencies like the CFA franc in West Africa, which he described as a tool of economic domination. The CFA franc, he noted, ties the economic fate of several African nations to European financial policy, stripping them of the ability to make independent fiscal decisions. Breaking free from such systems, he acknowledged, would be difficult but essential for true autonomy. Throughout his speech, Traoré was not merely theorizing or indulging in rhetoric. He was laying out a political philosophy rooted in action. His leadership in Burkina Faso has already made dramatic moves to expel foreign forces, reclaim control of national resources, and restructure governance to reflect popular needs. These steps are not without controversy, but they form the backbone of his message egg. Sovereignty must be defended not just in words, but in practice, and it will come at a cost. Perhaps most notably, Traoré did not ask for permission. He did not appeal for validation from the international community or seek applause from the African Union. Instead, he challenged them to follow suit. He posed uncomfortable questions to his peers. Can African leaders truly call themselves independent if their economies are built to serve foreign markets? If their militaries depend on foreign funding? If their people must look to Paris, Washington, or Beijing for approval? His speech, stripped of pleasantries, demanded a moral and political awakening. Traoré's vision of sovereignty is both radical and necessary. It demands that African nations stop viewing themselves as recipients of global charity or subjects of international order. and instead become architects of their own destiny. His speech left the African Union silent not because it lacked clarity, but because it held up a mirror many were reluctant to face. He laid bare the contradictions of a continent rich yet poor, independent yet dependent, proud yet often ruled by fear. And in doing so, he rekindled the long-standing dream of a free, united, and self-determined Africa. A dream whose time may finally be returning. In his address that shook the foundations of the African Union, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did more than speak about sovereignty. He illuminated the pivotal role of Africa's youth in redefining the continent's path. His words placed young Africans not at the periphery of political discourse, but at the very center of transformation. For too long, the youth have been treated as a demographic statistic, talked about in terms of potential, but rarely entrusted with actual power. Traoré challenged this status quo with conviction, declaring that the youth are not just the future. They are the present, and any strategy for Africa's liberation must begin with their full empowerment. Traoré's emphasis on youth empowerment was not symbolic. He spoke as someone who himself rose to national leadership in his mid-30s, representing a generational shift in African politics. In doing so, he became living proof that young leaders are not only capable but urgently necessary. He addressed a central irony that a continent with a median age of less than 20 is still predominantly governed by leaders in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. This generational imbalance, he argued, creates a disconnect between leadership priorities and the lived realities of the majority population. When decision-makers are far removed from the concerns of the youth, jobs, education, dignity, freedom, policy becomes inert and public trust erodes. The speech highlighted that African youth are not apathetic or disinterested in political progress. On the contrary, they are often the first to take to the streets, the first to speak out online, and the first to organize movements when injustice takes root. However, the political space in many African countries is deliberately constricted, closed off by entrenched elites who see youth activism as a threat rather than an opportunity. Traoré condemned this repression, noting that silencing young voices through censorship, arrests, or even violence only fuels frustration, disillusionment, and in some cases, radicalization. Instead of stifling youthful energy, he said, African leaders must harness it, channel it toward building institutions, developing new technologies, and reshaping the continent's narrative from the ground up. He drew attention to how the education systems across Africa often fail to equip young people with relevant skills, and worse, condition them to depend on systems that are inherently unequal. African students are taught to pass exams, memorize facts, and conform to standards set by institutions abroad. Very few are taught to challenge norms, to innovate, or to serve their communities through entrepreneurship or public service. Traoré urged for a complete overhaul of education, not just curriculum reform, but a transformation of purpose. Education, he insisted, must prepare African youth to solve African problems, not to dream of escaping to Europe or America. It must build critical thinkers, builders, and leaders, not passive job seekers in a saturated global economy. The speech also touched on the global dimension of youth empowerment. Traoré expressed frustration at how Western governments and international institutions often patronize African youth, engaging them in superficial dialogues or youth initiatives that provide platforms without substance. He criticized how young Africans are often flown to summits and forums to serve as diversity props, applauded for their enthusiasm, but excluded from real influence. These gestures, he said, are performative, not transformative. True empowerment is about agency, about giving young people control over budgets, policy-making processes, and institutions. Anything less is mere tokenism. Traoré also addressed the economic conditions faced by African youth, describing widespread unemployment as not just a crisis, but a betrayal. Millions of young people graduate each year into job markets that cannot absorb them, often leaving them vulnerable to exploitation, migration, or recruitment into extremist groups. He pointed out that the informal economy, where many young Africans survive through hustling, petty trade, or gig work, is neither protected nor supported. Youth are taxed without representation, policed without rights, and blamed for societal ills that are the result of decades of poor leadership. Traoré called for investment in youth-led industries, startups, agriculture, and technology, arguing that only by building sovereign economies can African nations begin to provide meaningful livelihoods for their young citizens. He was particularly sharp in criticizing the culture of gerontocracy, the idea that age equals wisdom and legitimacy, even when that age is accompanied by incompetence or corruption. Traoré noted that age alone cannot guarantee vision, courage, or connection to people's needs. He urged young Africans not to wait passively for permission to lead, but to organize, educate themselves, and push their way into the halls of power. He reminded the audience that many of Africa's independence leaders were themselves in their 30s or younger when they stood up against colonial rule. History, he said, was never changed by the timid or the comfortable. It was changed by the bold, often the young, who dared to dream of something better. The speech also delved into the cultural war being waged against African youth. Traoré expressed concern about the psychological colonization perpetuated through media, advertising, and imported cultural norms. He noted how young Africans are bombarded with images that tell them they are inadequate unless they consume Western products, live Western lifestyles, and abandon their traditions. This psychological warfare, he argued, robs the youth of confidence and pride. He called for a revival of African identity, one rooted in dignity, language, history, and solidarity. He insisted that youth empowerment must go hand in hand with cultural decolonization. A proud youth is a powerful youth, and a powerful youth is unstoppable. Traoré's message resonated not only because of its content, but because of the moment in which it was delivered. Across the continent, from Sudan to Senegal, from Congo to Kenya, young people have taken to the front lines of protest, resistance, and renewal. They are rejecting corrupt elites, refusing foreign domination, and reclaiming their voice. Traoré gave language to this resistance. He turned youthful frustration into a political principle, and he dared the African Union to listen, not to him, but to the millions he represents. The young people who are tired of waiting, tired of being told they are not ready, tired of being sacrificed for political stability, tired of being ignored until it's time to vote or fight wars they didn't start. In perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his speech, Captain Ibrahim Traoré forced the African Union to confront its own silence and complicity. He did not raise his voice to accuse, nor did he resort to overt theatrics. Instead, he posed pointed questions that lingered in the air with uncomfortable weight. Questions about why, in the face of so many injustices, the leadership of the continent often responds with silence. His critique was not aimed solely at external forces, but at the internal rot that has festered within African political institutions. The African Union, which was meant to be the guardian of continental unity and dignity, has too often become a bystander to crises, a passive observer of oppression, and a reluctant voice in moments demanding courage. Traoré made it clear that silence in the face of exploitation is not neutrality. It is betrayal. When African nations are destabilized by foreign interventions and the African Union issues vague statements of concern instead of direct action, it sends a clear messaging that sovereignty is conditional and injustice is tolerable as long as it does not disrupt diplomatic protocols. He challenged the Union to reflect on its purpose, whether it exists to serve the interests of African people or to maintain the comfort of political elites insulated from the consequences of their inaction. The silence he exposed was not simply about a lack of words, it was about a lack of moral clarity, a lack of collective will. He questioned the African Union's failure to stand firmly against coups when they are backed by external forces, yet their swift condemnation when they come from within, especially when those internal actors aim to dismantle neocolonial systems. The inconsistency Traoré implied was not accidental, it was political. There is a pattern of selective outrage, where African institutions speak out when it suits foreign partners or aligns with global media narratives, but remain muted when the true culprits of instability are foreign interests cloaked in diplomacy, trade deals, or military alliances. He warned that this selective silence erodes the credibility of African leadership and alienates the masses, especially the youth, who see through the hypocrisy. Traoré spoke about the silence surrounding foreign military presence on African soil. He recounted how certain African governments have allowed foreign powers to establish military bases under the guise of security and counterterrorism, while these very countries remain plagued by violence, displacement, and insecurity. He demanded to know why the African Union has not spoken louder about these contradictions. Why has it not challenged the logic of dependency or questioned the effectiveness of these foreign operations that, over decades, have failed to bring peace? Instead, Traoré noted, the African Union continues to operate in a diplomatic haze, unwilling to name the forces that perpetuate Africa's instability, because doing so might offend powerful allies. Another aspect of the Union's silence that Traoré attacked was its failure to protect democratic principles consistently. He criticized how elections are monitored superficially, corruption is overlooked, and regimes that suppress dissent are quietly tolerated as long as they maintain political continuity. He pointed out that the African Union has rarely intervened meaningfully when governments shut down the internet during protests, imprison opposition leaders, or manipulate constitutional term limits to remain in power. This kind of silence, he argued, signals to citizens that justice and democracy are negotiable, that they depend not on principle, but on the political convenience of the moment. He called attention to how the African Union reacts to crises like famine, disease, outbreaks, and conflict. Not with urgency, but often with bureaucratic caution. While NGOs and international agencies respond with funding and media coverage, the African Union's response is slow, riddled with internal politics, and disconnected from those on the ground. Traoré asked why a body built for African unity often feels so distant from African suffering. He questioned whether the African Union had become more of a diplomatic theater than a real engine of transformation. Traoré also spoke of the silence around economic sabotage. He laid bare how African economies are routinely undermined by unfair trade practices, debt traps, and the manipulation of currency systems like the CFA franc. These systems keep entire regions of the continent in financial bondage, yet the African Union has not mounted a serious challenge to them. He argued that African leaders must stop whispering their concerns behind closed doors and start speaking with one voice, publicly, unapologetically, and in defense of the people. If the African Union cannot call out systems designed to perpetuate African dependence, then who will? In a particularly striking moment, he addressed how the silence of African leadership extends even to issues of cultural degradation. Traoré described how African values, languages, and identities are being eroded by a flood of imported media, consumer products, and ideologies that devalue African life and wisdom. Yet the continent's institutions continue to promote Western models of success, governance, and development without protecting or celebrating the depth of African civilization. He wondered why African leaders remain silent while generations of youth are taught to admire everything foreign and question everything indigenous. The silence here, he said, is not only political, it is cultural, and it is costing Africa its soul. What made Traoré's critique so piercing was that he did not position himself as an outsider condemning the system from afar. He was speaking from within it, to those who share the same responsibilities and privileges he does. His words carried the weight of personal risk, yet he spoke them with calm resolve. He urged other leaders to break their silence, not for his sake, but for the people who can no longer afford the consequences of delay. To him, silence in leadership is the most dangerous form of complicity. It maintains the illusion of stability while the ground beneath is crumbling. He spoke to the contradiction of a continent that boasts of unity, while its people are divided by artificial borders, unequal treaties, and policies written in foreign capitals. He called on the African Union to reject its current role as a mediator of interests between Africa and the rest of the world and instead become an advocate for African self-determination. A platform where the truth can be spoken without fear. A body that does not just exist to manage relationships, but to defend principles. By exposing the silence and inaction of continental leadership, Traoré held a mirror up to the African Union, and by extension, to all African institutions. He challenged them to rediscover their voice, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to rise to the demands of a new generation that is no longer willing to accept symbolic gestures in place of transformative action.